Satsuma, the most recognized of the semi-dreadnoughts. A ship with a ridiculous number of heavy gun turrets, even of relatively small caliber. A ship that came oh so close to being the first all-big gun capital ship. A ship that is, by and large, forgotten even more than her successor, Kawachi. I think this is a bit of a shame, because her design is a fascinating one, as is her history. The thing to remember about Satsuma is that she was really quite a large leap of faith on the part of the Japanese. Their prior battleships had largely followed British trends, and been built in British yards at that, and this was to be their first swing at a domestically designed and built capital ship. Admittedly, still taking some influence, and in the case of Satsuma, parts, from the British, but still domestically designed and constructed. Unfortunately, this is somewhat reflected in, as with South Carolina, an incredibly lengthy construction period. For better or worse, these ships were laid down around the same time as Dreadnought, before her in Satsuma's case, and not completed until the Orions were the new kids soon to come onto the block. While indicative of Japanese industrial issues, it also goes to show that it is rather unlikely the ships could have beat Dreadnought into the water, even had they been finished to their original design. So I still doubt we would have been calling Dreadnoughts as Satsumas, though as I've mentioned before, that probably wouldn't have happened anyway. At any rate, the design of the ships should be covered as well. The Satsuma was, originally, fully intended to have all big guns, making her one of the first designs to actually reach a nearly finalized state with such a layout. At least that would have actually been accepted into service. At that stage in her design process, Satsuma would have had a typical pre-Dreadnought layout of two twin 12-inch turrets on the center line. Again, typical, one on the bow, one on the stern. The remaining 12-inch guns, then, would have been mounted on the wings. Two twin turrets, with one mounted on port and the other starboard side, with four single-gun turrets rounding it out on the corners. In this regard, you can see the legacy of pre-Dreadnought designs and the sometimes slow change in battleship design, even as big guns replace intermediate ones. Satsuma's initial design here is quite similar, in fact, to the previous Katori class, at least in terms of gun layout, simply swapping the 10-inch guns for 12-inch and adding an extra twin turret on either flank of the ship. Perhaps not the most efficient of gun layouts, but also fairly typical of the time, albeit with heavier guns. 12 of them, in fact. 12 of the 12-inch guns would have made them, had they been completed in time, the most heavily armed battleship in the world, albeit with a layout that would not allow for using all the guns on either broadside. Katori, for what it's worth, was based heavily on the then-new King Edward VII class, but with 10-inch guns instead of 9.2-inch for the intermediate battery. Again, you still see the British influence here. While Japan was going to build the ships in their own docks, with imported materials for some bits, the shortage of 12-inch guns precluded completing them to the original design. Japan was fully capable of building these guns under license by this point, but they weren't quite up to building enough quickly enough. The rising costs also made it distinctly unattractive to build 24 guns between the two ships, and that's not even counting the need for spare barrels. As these ships also used an older model 12-inch gun, it would have been difficult to get any from the British, even ignoring that Britain was already in the process of stealing guns off the Lord Nelsons to slap onto Dreadnought in order to get her done quicker. Because of this, the Satsuma design morphed from an inefficient all-big gun design into the prototypical Semi-Dreadnought we ended up with. Not to say the design isn't interesting in its own right. While, true enough, the ships only maintained the same 4 12-inch guns of any pre-Dreadnought, they had no fewer than 12 10-inch guns as well. 3 twin turrets on either flank for a broadside of 6 of them, in addition to the 4 12-inchers. While of a mixed caliber, that remains a 10-gun broadside of, relatively, heavy guns. Satsuma has the heaviest broadside of any semi-dreadnought in terms of shell weight. After all, 10-inch guns were still light battleship guns in this period. Raw firepower does, of course, disguise the fact that an all big gun ship is still more efficient in use of tonnage and fire control. That remains an issue with Satsuma, and is even amplified because you have 3 turrets with guns nearly the same size as your 2 main turrets on either broadside. But there's enough of a difference in gun velocity and shell travel between 10 and 12-inch guns that it messes with fire control something fierce. So you have more guns firing faster, but not firing at the same trajectory as the slower and smaller in number, bigger guns. Past the turreted guns, Satsuma and her sister Aki, or is it Aki, do differ from one another for their lighter guns. Satsuma carried a dozen 4.7-inch guns in casemates, while I'm going to go with Aki carried 8 6-inch guns. They each carried 5 torpedo tubes, though, which is pretty standard for the time period in question. The differences between the ships continue when you get to propulsion. Satsuma maintained the old triple expansion engines, making her a somewhat conservative design in that regard. Again, somewhat like South Carolina. Aki, on the other hand, used turbines. This was due to the fact that Japan lacked enough slipways to build the sisters together, and Aki had to wait for an armored cruiser, Tsukuba, to complete and free up a slipway. The IJN took the chance to make changes to Aki, such as the turbines and the larger secondary guns. You can also see this in the fact that Aki had 3 funnels as opposed to 2, the easiest way to tell the sisters apart. It does rather lend credence to considering the ships half-sisters, depending on who you ask. I've seen them described as such, or Aki as a subclass, or just calling them plain old sister ships. I tend to fall on the last one, if only because you see the exact same thing in the United States, Oklahoma and Nevada, or North Dakota and Delaware. You see the exact same thing there. They have one ship with triple expansion engines and one ship with turbines. Same secondaries, though. While they have their differences, the sisters are identical in terms of armor protection. A 9-inch belt narrowing to 4 inches towards the ends. This is on the thin side for a ship their size, as Dreadnought was even considered a tad on the thin side at 11 inches for her thickest belt armor. One would think this would lead to an increase in speed, as is often the case with relatively lightly armored battleships, like the Italian battleships. Not so in this case, however, as Satsuma could only manage a bit under 19 knots at best, and Aki barely got above 20. Their service history was a bit uneventful. The ships would see a little bit of fairly typical peacetime duty prior to World War I, and after World War I began, get up to a bit of adventure with taking German colonial holdings in the Pacific, but that was about it. Satsuma had a couple scares with damage, I suppose. One time on gunnery training in 1911, she had one of her 12-inch guns suffer a misfire-induced explosion. Her crew, having realized the shell hadn't fired, opened the breech to check, which promptly set it off and killed about 24 of them. Later on in late 1912, she got lightly damaged by a typhoon. It would seem Halsey isn't the only one to drive a ship into one of those things. At any rate, their service was suitably low-key for ships that were obsolete even before they launched. With the Washington Treaty leading to a mass scrapping of obsolete ships, the sisters were disarmed and expended in gunnery exercises. Aki by Kongo and Hyuga, and Satsuma by the Nagato sisters in 1924. These ships were somewhat cursed from the outset, changed from inefficient, all big gun warships into the epitome of the Semi-Dreadnought. Obsolete before they hit the water, and unlike South Carolina, none of their design features were carried forward for long. Still, they were the first Japanese capital ships built by the Japanese, and for that, you can't undersell how important that is. It set the stage for the long and fruitful career of Japanese warship builders that would eventually culminate in the largest battleships to see combat.